Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I really haven't gone over this 430 for a little while. And there's a couple new little things that are happening with the car. I wanted to discuss them. I wanted to go over the car a little bit more in detail with new things that I found out about the car from doing research and trying to figure out exactly what this car is. I do know it's a challenge car, but I also know it's a GT3 car. There's other people out there on the forums and things that have said that it is not a GT3 car because it doesn't have the Kessel badge in it. However, Kessel wasn't the only company that made the GT3 cars. They're not the only authority in GT3 cars. So this is a GT3 car. One of the things that someone told me was, well, check the headers and see if they're a 4-to-1 collector straight piped out the back, because all the challenge cars were just, you know, the manifolds with high flow cats and exhaust, and the GT3 cars all had the 4-to-1 collector. That's exactly what this car has. I pulled the car up on the lift, pulled the under tray out from underneath it, looked up, there it is, 4-to-1 collector headers. This car is the loudest car I've ever heard. That's why, because it is straight piped right out the back. But it also has all the other GT3 car treatments that the GT3 cars have. So let's take a look at the car. Let's discuss what each one of those things are. Yeah, hopefully I can clear up a couple of things that people don't believe that this is a GT3 car. The reason why I want to make this video is because this really is a super, super cool car, a very rare car. Quite honestly, it's even more rare than quite a few of the other GT3 cars out there, because the GT3 cars were homologated to race. Now, this car is a challenge car, and it would have been homologated to race in challenge because it was actually a factory-built Ferrari challenge car. However, to race in GT3, they would have had to get re-homologated for the GT3 series. I believe that this car just didn't get homologated. It was built as a GT3 car with all the GT3 treatments, just not homologated to race in the GT3 series. What does that mean? Pretty much absolutely nothing now, because this car would not be able to run in a GT3 series anyways. And if it was going to go run in some historic event, then it could run under whatever clarification they deem necessary based on horsepower to weight ratio probably. So I would think maybe you could try to race it as a challenge car in some sort of historical challenge event, but most likely not, because it's a GT3 car. So what is it that made the GT3 cars? Well, back then, it definitely wasn't the difference it is now. Now, the GT3 cars are so much different than the typical Challenge or Super Trofeo or things like that that get built from the factory. So the Challenge cars were just kind of the basic car that you ran in the series that was backed and kind of sponsored by Ferrari. They were the ones that built the car. In the Lamborghini world, it's kind of like the Super Trofeo series. And back then, what they were doing is they were just taking those challenge cars, upfitting them to make them faster and run into the GT3 series. Nowadays, there's just completely different cars built for both series. So it wouldn't even be a question of whether it was a GT3 car or a challenge car like a Super Trofeo or a GT3 Huracan. They're completely different cars. Suspension's completely different. Everything about them are completely different. But back then, that wasn't necessarily the case. They were very similar cars that were just upfitted. So this car was upfitted with the full GT3 carbon Kevlar body. You've got these wider fenders here that aren't on a standard challenge car. You've got this completely different front bonnet, completely different front bumper that is wider to meet up with these wider fenders. As far as I can tell, this is called the Scuderia GT3 front bumper. It's almost identical to a Scuderia bumper, just a little bit wider. And then this opening here is a little bit larger to be able to feed air into all of these intakes for the radiators to cool the engine. You've got a GT3 spec front splitter. You got a wider stance here to be able to fill up the fender flares from these wider fenders. And then back here in the back of the car, we've got a completely different rear bumper. We've got a completely different rear diffuser. Now, I've seen GT3 cars even that don't have this diffuser. I've seen the GT3 cars that have just kind of the standard rear fascia from the challenge cars with kind of the standard challenge rear diffuser. This is complete GT3 all the way. So then the question became, you know, what kind of exhaust does this car have? Of course, I've just discussed it. It's completely straight piped out the back with race headers. So by all accounts, this is a GT3 car. This wasn't the actual GT3 wing that would have been on the car. the GT3 wing that would have been on the car is right over here. So this was the actual GT3 wing that was on the car. It could always be put back on. I've called to try and get a replacement version of this, $8,000. So quite honestly, this entire car, as a GT3 car, could have been built by almost anyone that wanted to run in a GT3 series. All they would have needed to do is buy all the parts to upfit it to a GT3 car and put those on the car themselves, like Kessel did. So there was other race teams that did the same thing, that built GT3 cars, and so that's pretty much what this car is. So other than that, there were probably a couple of computer tunes that they would have done to the engine to be able to make it run a little bit hotter, because the exhaust got opened up a little bit, so this engine is going to definitely push more power than the typical challenge car. That's really about it. They're a challenge car built into a GT3 car. Very rare car, very hard to come by all these parts to be able to build a GT3 car, but nonetheless, here she is. In all of her glory. Now, something a little strange about these challenge cars is the fact that all of them had these bolt-in cages. GT3 cars, challenge cars, same cage. They could absolutely add more bars to them if they wanted to, but this is how they came from the factory. Cool thing is this one is still bolted in. This car has a title that's on its way to me, so this car is going to be able to be licensed, and it would literally probably be one of the most comfortable race cars that you could turn into a street car. And you could unbolt the cage, leave this rear section here as a roll cage so that you still have your crossbar to be able to mount all your harnesses and things like that. So you've got your harness bar, you've got a full roll cage in the back, but you could eliminate all of this cage up here so you get a little bit better visibility. Also, on the street, without a helmet on, it would make it much safer to drive the car and easier to get in and out of. And if you wanted to go to the track and you felt like you wanted that safety, you could always bolt it right back in. So from a standpoint on this car, if you wanted to utilize it as a track car or as a street car, you would be able to do both. Now, I have owned a Ferrari Scuderia, a 430 Scuderia. It was a 2009. I've driven that car on the street a lot, and I drove that car on the track. What's pretty awesome about this car is it feels very much like a Scuderia. In the Scuderia, it didn't have carpet, it didn't have any of that stuff, so that car was very, I wouldn't say obnoxious, but it was very engaging to drive on the street because you got to tell and hear everything that was going on outside of the car, all the pebbles that were flipping up into the fender liners, things like that. That was a very engaging, enthusiastic car, and on the track, it felt very much like a race car. So I would say to anyone out there that's looking at a car like this is literally a completely souped up version of a Ferrari Scuderia that you would be able to take on the street and on the track, and it'll be one step cooler because this is a true race car, and this car is fantastic. Check out the dash. The display that you would end up having in this car is completely different than you're going to get in a 430 Scuderia. There isn't another car on the market that's going to give you the feeling of a Scuderia and a race car at the same time other than this one right here. Now, if you don't believe me how loud this car is, I've got my mic right here and maybe you can hear me, but this car is so loud. If you wanted to drive this thing on the street, I would 100% recommend putting back in some sort of a muffler.